Uh, well, still damage assessment going on. So
Yeah.
we're just lucky to be, we didn't lose anybody. So
yeah,
thank you.
of course. And I was down in I'm in Seattle right now. I was in New Mexico and headed back to Alaska today, and just watching that so closely and just thinking of all of you, and how important the work we're going to talk about is. I mean, if nothing, unfortunately, has highlighted the need for us to do this work, this is it. So sorry for all of you.
Oh gosh. Well, we're survivors, so
Yeah. Indeed, you are, my friend. Yeah, indeed. But
yeah.
I hope the state and the federal agencies come and help really quickly.
Yes, I think they are.
Good. That's good to hear. How's Bob?
Oh, he's fine. He's been busy trying to do what he can to help every. No. Those areas have
Yeah.
changed. So
referred to as the land of the midnight sun or the top of the world, evokes images of the northern lights, the running of the iconic Iditarod dog sled race, and of course, polar bears. We don't imagine the increasing toxic algae blooms on Alaska's seafloor or increasing burn areas or boreal forest fires. Nor do we picture the sinking homes and impassable roads caused by thawing of the once frozen ground they built upon. But these are the realities faced by the 4 million people living in the Arctic. These realities become even more dire over the weekend as Western Alaska faced the strongest September storm seen in 70 years. The storm caused record storm surge of nearly 9 feet in some areas, flooding and buildings to be swept off of their foundation. Environmental changes have had many social, cultural, and economic impacts, including on the food security of many local communities. The Arctic is warming faster than any other part of the globe. Some changes are seen in a matter of years, not decades. Now, more than ever, it is becoming clearer that what happens in the Arctic has both local and global impacts. People in my home state of Texas experienced a historic winter storm in February of 2021 that left many without running water, power, or heat for days. Researchers have linked this storm, Western wildfires, and other extreme weather events in the lower 48 states to warming of the Arctic. Support of robust, coordinated Arctic research and science is critical. I applaud the interagency effort and work of experts to develop the 2022 to 2026 Arctic Research Plan. I look forward to hearing how the plan will lay the foundation for our priorities for the next 5 years. The changes in the Arctic are happening today, and we must be agile and strategic in our response. This starts with working meaningfully with local and indigenous communities of Alaska and the Arctic who know their needs the most. Efforts have been made to bridge indigenous knowledge and Western science, but more needs to be done to elevate co-production of knowledge in the research enterprise. Research opportunities such as field research and expeditions are a highlight for many scientists who study the Arctic. Unfortunately, the feeling is not always mutual among local communities. We must find ways to build better relationships if the research is to be as productive as possible. In addition, the expanded participation in Arctic research, we must also strengthen and increase our Arctic science capabilities, including research vessels, infrastructure, and facilities which are constrained. If we are to continue our leadership in Arctic science, what additional capabilities are necessary? Likewise, what are our plans to support more robust monitoring, observing, modeling, and prediction that will help us better understand changes in the Arctic? Well, we have a lot to address at this morning hearing, and I again want to thank our witnesses for being here. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lucas for his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairwoman Johnson, and thank you for holding today's hearing to examine our national R&D efforts in the Arctic. The Arctic presents us with a variety of scientific and technical challenges and opportunities because of its unique environmental, geopolitical, and resource structure. We're currently experiencing a period of unprecedented changes in all these areas, and our investments in fundamental Arctic-related research will be critical to understand and adapting to these changes. In 2017, I had the opportunity to visit the Arctic and witness firsthand the research being conducted there, including the Barrow Arctic Research Center. One of the highlights of this trip was being outfitted in cold weather gear and touring Summit Station, a critical research facility at the summit of the Greenland ice sheet. This trip to the Arctic demonstrated to me the sensitivity that the environment to things like changing carbon dioxide levels. The scientific data that is being collected at our Arctic research centers and field stations are key to understanding the factors affecting the Arctic's regional atmosphere, ocean, and sea ice over. And when we understand these changes, we can make informed decisions related to the region, the continent, U.S., and the entire globe. So I appreciate the great work being done by many of our agencies to further this understanding. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is conducting extensive data gathering and research activities through multiple programs, informing decisions support for unique Arctic hazards such as river ice breakup, fires, coastal flooding. NASA is gathering critical remote sensing observations from aircrafts and satellites to inform Earth system science and Arctic research modeling. The National Science Foundation is supporting innovation, convergent research through navigating the new Arctic program. The United States is only one of 8 Arctic nations, and as such, it has a critical role to play in the future of the region. This is especially true, as we look at the economic and geopolitical consequences of the rapid changes occurring in the Arctic. Territorial disputes in this region are taking on greater importance as resource-rich land and new shipping routes are revealed. There are significant economic implications from the energy rights, mineral deposits, and tourism opportunities being uncovered. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on international cooperation in the Arctic. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine violated the core principles of sovereignty, and I stand with the decision to suspend engagement in the Arctic Council. As a result, the U.S. must leverage and expand our research partnerships with our Arctic and non-Arctic allies to ensure that the U.S. remains a leader in the region. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how the research conducted in the Arctic plays a central role in understanding and addressing the key consequences of change in the region and how the U.S. can play a leading role in the new Arctic. Thank you for being here today, and I yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Larry Hensman, who serves in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, as the Assistant Director for Polar Sciences. He is also the Executive Director of the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee and is leading the effort to implement the 2022-2026 Federal Arctic Research Plan. He recently served as the President of the International Arctic Science Committee and as the Vice Chancellor for Research and Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. Our next witness is Dr. Mike Sfraga, who is the Chairman of the United States Arctic Research Commission and the founding director of the Polar Institute at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. A geographer by training, his work focuses on the change in geography of the Arctic and Antarctic landscapes, Arctic policy, and the implications of a change in climate on political, science, social, and economic, environmental, and security regimes in the Arctic. He previously served as a distinguished co-lead scholar for the U.S. Department of State's inaugural Fulbright Arctic Initiative from 2015 to 2017, a complementary program to the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Our third witness, Dr. Vera Kingjikut Metcalf, Since 2002, she has served as the director of the Eskimo Walrus Commission at COACA. The commission represents 19 coastal Alaska Native communities to promote community involvement in research, document Indigenous knowledge, and co-manage the Pacific walrus population. She also is a Bering Strait Commissioner for the U.S. Department of State, facilitating travel between the Indigenous people and Chukotho, Russia, and the Strait region in Alaska. Our final witness, Dr. Susan Natalie. She is the Arctic Program Director and a senior scientist at Woodwell Climate Research Center. She is also a renowned Arctic ecologist whose research focus is on permafrost. She is currently leading a project called Permafrost Pathways, which is designed to amplify efforts to collect the best data on Arctic carbon emissions, contextualize this information within the global budget, and transform the science into actionable policy. As our witnesses should know, you each will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When all of you have completed your spoken testimony, you will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. We will start now with Dr. Hensman.
Thank you. Chairwoman Johnson, Representative Ranking Member Lucas, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for holding this important hearing. I am Dr. Larry Hensman. I am honored to appear before you today. I serve as the Executive Director of the Interagency Arctic Research and Policy Committee and as the Assistant Director for Polar Sciences at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I live in Fairbanks, Alaska, and have been engaged in Arctic research for almost 40 years. I'd like to take just a brief moment to first acknowledge the suffering and loss occurring in both Alaska and Puerto Rico. The Alaskan typhoon was a huge storm, and there has been terrible damage that was spread over 1,000 miles of Alaska coastline. I have worked in several of these Alaska communities and worry about their recovery from the devastation before winter sets in. I will start by commending this committee for your visionary leadership in shaping Arctic policy, both in current times and in recent decades. Today, I will testify about the necessity of Arctic research and the work of Iarpc, and I also will remark upon the importance of research infrastructure required for Arctic research, international collaboration, and respectful engagement with Indigenous peoples as key facets of Arctic research. The U.S. is an Arctic nation. The ongoing environmental and climate changes in the Arctic have impacts across the American economy and society. Environmental changes in the Arctic reverberate through the globe, affecting coastlines, weather, and availability of resources in more temperate regions. It is in the U.S. national interest to understand Arctic processes and their impacts on the global system. The Arctic territory is remote and data sparse, and thus understanding Arctic change requires significant effort, expertise, and commitment to sustaining and recapitalizing critical research infrastructure. The Arctic is ongoing rapid change in ecological and socioeconomic responses to climate and other drivers. Climate effects are causing direct and indirect impacts on the region's physical, chemical, and biological environments. Social, cultural, and environmental changes alter the fabric of Indigenous and other communities and may inhibit the preservation of Alaska Native cultures and Indigenous knowledge. Economic change can bring opportunities, but also dislocation as local residents are trained to work in fields that may not exist or persist in their home regions. This region is geographically vast, sparsely populated, and characterized by strong connections among its Indigenous peoples and the land and the sea. Adaptation to climate change intersects with other environmental issues and needed policies confronting Arctic residents, including those concerning food security, human health and welfare, environmental security and quality of life, and the resilience of ecosystems. Iarpc facilitates partnerships and collaborations that improve our understanding of the rapidly changing Arctic system and its impact on the Earth system through critical advances in cryosphere, atmosphere, ocean, and ecosystem science, advanced modeling and projections of environmental dynamics, and future climate conditions, improved understanding of current and future Arctic change, and advanced human-centered research critical to the Alaskan community health, infrastructure, and environmental safety. This plan builds on the administration's priorities for racial equity and tribal engagement. This plan includes participatory research and Indigenous leadership in research as a foundational activity to support true engagement and community participation and co-production of knowledge. The Arctic scientific community is very strong and collaborative. The federal agencies leading Arctic research are making important contributions to help the people of the United States and the world prepare for an uncertain future, but one that is certainly different from today. Our nation must continue to invest in Arctic research as the Arctic is demonstrating an outsized effect on the global climate system. The benefits are clearly far greater than the cost. We must place greater emphasis upon convergent science that draws together relevant disciplines, scientific, engineering, and social changes to resolve more complex or sophisticated challenges to our communities. So I'll say again, it is in the U.S. national interest to understand Arctic processes and their impacts to the global system. I thank you again for convening this important hearing and allowing me the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sfraga.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for convening this hearing today on Arctic research. I'm Dr. Mike Sfraga, and I'm honored to appear before you today. Like Dr. Hensman, I too am a resident of Fairbanks, Alaska, and I also serve as the presidentially appointed chair of the United States Arctic Research Commission. The knowledge and understanding we gain from Arctic research inform our nation's Arctic policies and actions on climate change, infrastructure development, energy security, economic development, as well as community, homeland, and national security. The United States Arctic Research Commission is an independent federal agency established by the Arctic Research Policy Act that plays a central role in advancing these issues. Sound research informs sound policy development and implementation. The Commission publishes a biannual report to the White House and Congress on Arctic research goals and objectives. This report guides the development of our nation's Arctic research plan that is produced by Iarpc, as described by Dr. Hensman. In my written testimony, I have included a full description of the Commission, our current members, and our duties assigned by law. Here's a preview of the 5 overarching Arctic research goals that will be included in the Commission's next report. The first is environmental risk and hazard. The superstorm that just inundated and devastated so many communities along the Bering Strait region of my home state of Alaska is a sad, yet poignant reminder of the vulnerability of our Arctic communities. Our report will recommend research to improve coastal community resilience planning, enhance Arctic observing and monitoring efforts, and encourage seafloor depth mapping to improve marine commerce. According to our colleagues at NOAA, only 4.1% of the United States maritime Arctic has been mapped to modern standards. 2, community health and well-being. The investment of more than $11 billion into Alaska Native communities through the Infrastructure Act will help communities adapt to a warming climate. They'll build water and sanitation infrastructure and expand access to broadband. Remaining challenges, however, include the enduring presence of health disparities in many parts of Alaska. Food, energy, water insecurity, housing and indoor air quality deficiencies, and workforce development insufficiencies are still present. Our third area will be infrastructure. The Commission recommends research to improve access to reasonably priced broadband networks, telehealth, in-home running water, and affordable heat and fuel, all of which must be operable and scalable in Arctic conditions. Infrastructure that is practical and functional at the community level is critical, and human infrastructure, people to teach, create, operate, and maintain technology is also essential, yet often underappreciated and overlooked. Our fourth area will be economic research, new for the Commission. While economic research is vital to inform Arctic relevant policies and decision-making, few economists focus on the region. Economic research can help achieve regional sustainable development and provide a greater understanding of market and non-market forces. Our fifth area will be research cooperation. As many Arctic issues are circumpolar in nature and inherently transnational, they are best addressed by domestic and international research cooperation, which brings me to an opportunity in interagency cooperation. That opportunity is to equip, for scientific research purposes, the commercially available polar icebreaker that the Coast Guard intends to purchase with funds in its FY23 budget request to Congress. The Commission recommends that if this icebreaker is procured and is refit to meet the Coast Guard's requirements, that the refit includes scientific research infrastructure to meet science mission requirements. Madam Chairman and Ranking Member Lucas, it is impossible to discuss Arctic research without acknowledging that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has halted cooperation with Russia on international Arctic research activities. There have been many programs impacted by this lack of cooperation. Nevertheless, Arctic research will continue because it must. Changes in the Arctic will not wait for geopolitical challenges to be settled. The challenges can be met by doubling down on our Arctic research efforts and by working with many of our partners in and outside of the region. Finally, I would like to express the Commission's support for proposed updates to the Arctic Research Policy Act contained in legislation introduced by Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska in S 4736, the Arctic Commitment Act. In particular, I'd like to call attention to the need and value of an Arctic research budget crosscut of the relevant federal agencies. We do not have an accurate account of what our nation spends on Arctic research, nor the funding trends over time. To improve accountability and to help achieve our nation's objectives in the Arctic, we encourage the Office of Management and Budget to conduct an annual budget crosscut, as it does for other research initiatives, such as nanotechnology and global change. Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Lucas and members of the committee, thank you again for this opportunity to testify today and provide the U.S. Arctic Research Commission's views and priorities on Arctic research. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Metcalf.
Good morning, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of this committee. I am truly honored to be part of this hearing and to present to you today. Before beginning, I must say that it is my intention that my words are proper and responsible to my ancestors, my family, and my community, and to our Nangaanakbut, which is our way of life and cultural values on St. Lawrence Island, Alaska. My name is Vera King Metcalf, born and raised on St. Lawrence Island, which lies in the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia's Chukotka Peninsula. I have been the executive director of the Eskimo Walrus Commission in Nome, Alaska since 2002. EWC was formed in 1978 with membership from 19 Alaska Native communities on the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas, and works to be necessary and valuable partners in Pacific walrus conservation and management through actively participating in research, striving for our Indigenous food security, and contributing our Indigenous knowledge. It is important for me to state upfront that Alaska Native people cannot be separated from our environment and natural resources. We are and always have been absolutely dependent on this intimate relationship with our environment and its gifts. If they are healthy, so are we. So what is Indigenous knowledge? In my language, it is Lisimak Tlachbut, which simply translated is our knowledge, what we know. But it implies so much more that's not so easily explained, and includes the understanding that we can only know so much. It adds a bit of humility to how much we think we know, because as my IK experts remind us sometimes, there is always more to know. IK is an ongoing synthesis of new information and observations gathered firsthand and from others which are considered by IK experts who together apply their cultural understanding and IK to guide future plans and decision-making. It is an active social process based in cultural protocols and grounded in our way of knowing. I have offered examples in my written testimony of how Alaska Native communities have contributed their IKs to co-management and examples of co-production of knowledge projects that I anxiously hope that are helpful to this committee. I have characterized the old school way science and government has conducted research in the Arctic in the past as one-sided and very extractive. And I have described the mismatch of the science, research, government industry with the Indigenous knowledge community. I suggested it might be helpful to recognize the difference between knowledge systems and how that affects co-production research. It is very important to realize that Indigenous knowledge isn't any one person's intellectual property, and no one person is the holder of a community's Indigenous knowledge, and that is not something simply to be documented as data to be used by others for their purposes. Instead, its true value is found when it is applied by our experts and knowledge bearers to questions about the health and conditions of their world, the land, the water, air, and all who inhabit it. Engaging IK for co-production projects needs to involve the larger community and should provide opportunities for multiple IK experts to discover all the nuance and the wisdom of what they jointly share. Their contribution together will be much more powerful. So I'll end with this thought. The Arctic is our home, eternal and sacred. We will continue to adapt as we need it to live properly in it. Perhaps collaborating on co-production knowledge research is simply another way that we are adapting. We will share our Indigenous knowledge to advance research. While it is beyond translation, this profoundest IK and way of knowing in my language is Isla. It encompasses and connects all things. This is what we will continue to rely on, and we will have greater confidence knowing it is included in future scientific study and in new governance in the Arctic. Thank you for this opportunity again.
Thank you very much. Dr. Susan Natalie.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify at today's hearing. My name is Dr. Susan Natali, and I'm the Arctic Program Director and a Senior Scientist at Woodwell Climate Research Center. Woodwell is a nonprofit organization made up of research scientists and policy experts dedicated to advancing climate policy solutions. My work focuses on the local to global effects of permafrost thaw in Arctic and boreal regions. Next slide, please. Permafrost is ground that has been frozen for at least 2 consecutive years and often for hundreds to thousands of years. It underlies about 15% of the Northern Hemisphere land and 38% of Alaska's lands. Permafrost has exceptional significance for global climate because it holds a massive amount of ancient frozen carbon. There's an estimated 1.4 trillion tons of carbon in the permafrost region, which is roughly twice as much carbon as is currently contained in the Earth's atmosphere. This carbon has accumulated for millennia from dead plants and animals, which cold and frozen conditions have prevented from fully decomposing. But rapid warming across the northern region, which is now occurring 3 to 4 times faster than the global average, is causing permafrost to thaw. An estimated 7% of near-surface permafrost has already been lost across the Arctic, and about 25 to 70% of permafrost is expected to thaw over the next century. Once thawed, the accumulated carbon in the soil can be decomposed and released into the atmosphere as greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane. Next slide, please. Over the coming decades, the amount of carbon released from thawing permafrost could be equivalent to continued emissions from major greenhouse gas emitting nations, perhaps even as large as or larger than the United States at our current emission rate. Greenhouse gas emissions from thawing permafrost could use up 25 to 40% of our remaining carbon budget to stay below 2 degrees Celsius warming. Yet these emissions are generally underaccounted, in part due to major gaps in Arctic carbon monitoring and modeling. The failure to accurately account for permafrost emissions undermines the integrity and efficacy of global mitigation policy. By not accounting for permafrost emissions, we're essentially aiming for the wrong climate target, making it that much harder to mitigate climate warming. Next slide, please. Improving understanding of permafrost thaw is also critical for informing climate adaptation policies. When permafrost thaws, it can induce ground collapse, which is impacting homes and infrastructure, Arctic lands, water, wildlife, subsistence resources, and indigenous ways of living. Further, the interacting hazards of permafrost thaw, erosion, and flooding are being exacerbated by more severe storm impacts, as was witnessed in Alaska this past week. More than 70, next slide please, more than 70 villages across Alaska face significant threats from erosion, flooding, or permafrost thaw. For over a decade, the GAO has warned that impacted communities need federal government support to adapt to climate change, and in the most severe cases, this may include relocation. Yet there still is no national relocation governance framework or dedicated and coordinated funding mechanism to facilitate planned relocation, which will become a critical need not only in Alaska, but across the nation. Next slide. Arctic residents and scientists have been observing permafrost thaw for decades, but we cannot fully address this problem without amplified research and policy support from Congress. I highlight 5 areas that I feel should be prioritized for increased research support. First, strategic funding opportunities for permafrost as a larger scope and long-term research priority. Second, focused investment to reduce uncertainty in climate monitoring and modeling. Third, improved interagency coordination on Arctic research planning and funding. Fourth, recognition that permafrost thaw, like climate change, is an international issue that warrants international solutions, including pathways for data exchange, grant funding, and equipment sharing. And fifth, direct support to Alaska Native tribes to co-produce knowledge and to lead climate change research. Today's hearing demonstrates the committee's dedication to confronting the climate crisis through a participatory and transparent process. I look forward to seeing members of this committee lead that effort, and I offered my continued support. Thank you.
Great. At this point, we'll begin our first round of questions, and the chair will recognize herself for 5 minutes. Dr. Hensman, the Arctic Research and Policy Act was enacted 40 years ago, and Congress last amended it in 1990. 4 decades of changes in the Arctic have had social, cultural, environmental, and economic impacts. How has research planning evolved to address today's challenges? And what steps did the Iarpc take to balance fundamental research priorities and research to address local research needs? And what are the most important research questions that we need to address, the most significant unknowns?
Well, thank you, Representative.
Known and unknowns, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Stevens. That's a very large question. So the Arctic Research and Policy Act was established in 1984 and was initiated to facilitate coordination, collaboration among federal agencies in their investment in Arctic research, to ensure that we had minimal duplication, to ensure that we could facilitate the partnerships and collaboration needed. And I think that that has been very successful over the last 40 years. I am very pleased to see the coordination that we have today amongst the partnerships and the collaborations among the agencies. So Iarpc does exist to facilitate that partnership. Iarpc hosts a platform we call Iarpc Collaborations, which exists to enable the collaborations among federal researchers, the researchers, scientists in the agencies with the non-federal researchers from universities, foundations, and international researchers. And it has been very successful in identifying the priorities that are of most urgent need to the United States, to our federal agencies, and focus this large partnership of researchers on those issues. And so there's been remarkable work done, and I think there is a need to as Dr. Sfraga said, there is a need to update that policy, but I am pleased with where we are today.
Well, all hail research collaboratives like Iarpc, and thank you to the dedicated researchers who are part of it. And Dr. Sfraga, the witnesses today have described rapid changes in the Arctic, critical partnership and research needs, limited research vessels, and sinking research infrastructure. The Arctic Research and Policy Act directs OSTP to review agency budget requests related to the Arctic and directs OMB to consider all agency requests as one integrated multi-agency request and review it prior to submission of the budget for adherence to the 5-year research plan. How would you characterize the degree to which this has been carried out over the years, and what should it look like moving forward to ensure Congress can carry out sufficient oversight of the Arctic research budget?
Thank you, Representative Stevens. I can say that although Dr. Hensman has provided us a very good, practical, and informative narrative regarding the work that has been done by Iarpc and by the Arctic Research Commission and the research community, I can see that definitively. What I cannot say is that we have a very good handle on the amount of investment our nation makes in Arctic research. As you noted, ARPA has been in place for 4 decades. We have not had a comprehensive budget crosscut for our federal research, Arctic research, done any time that I can remember. And by that, I mean, we simply don't know in aggregate what we're spending on Arctic research in the United States. We simply don't know that we have the resources available to us to implement, to fund the Iarpc plan as outlined by Dr. Hinzman. And so what my recommendation and our commission's recommendation is that we have a budget crosscut done each year by the Office of Management and Budget to secure good data on what each federal agency is spending on Arctic research. So we have a baseline and we can see our trending and funding over time. That demand for Arctic research will only continue, which means the request for resources from Congress will only continue. But I think we need a solid baseline of what it is we spend right at the moment on Arctic research. Then I can answer the second part, I think, of your question, Representative Stevens, which is how can we take the Iarpc plan, which they have spent so much time building for our nation in a rapid time of change? How do we know and how can we secure the resources to implement that plan? So A, we need a good idea of our baseline over time, what we have provided for Arctic research, and that should be done every year. And 2, we should take the plan that Dr. Hinzman and his colleagues have put together, and we should crosswalk that with available funding to actually understand whether or not we can implement, whether we can afford, whether we can enable the research plan that he and his colleagues have put together.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And, we understand that our Iarpc is comprised of 17 federal agencies, departments, and offices. Again, a great example of a whole of government approach. NSF and NOAA alone budget about $230 million annually towards Arctic-related work as part of Iarpc. And so we will get a question for the record to Dr. Hensman as we move to the next witness, or excuse me, the next member for questioning. And I believe that's Mr. Lucas here.
Thank you.
5 minutes.
Dr. Hensman and Dr. Sfraga. Data collected in 2019 by a fleet of sail drone unmanned surface vehicles in the Arctic was found by NASA and NOAA to have a remarkably strong correlation to the measurements taken by satellite. Time and time again, commercial data has proven accurate and beneficial to federal agencies at a cost-effective price. What role do you see the private sector and commercial data playing in the future of Arctic research? And along with that, should the administration better utilize commercial data buys and partnerships?
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Lucas. Excellent question and really profound insight in that the commercial capabilities have advanced remarkably in the past few decades, and they have opened up our capabilities tremendously, not just through sail drones, but through sub-ocean technology and through radio communications, through telemetry that we can impart in the field through data loggers. It's been a remarkable accomplishment. And without the contributions, without the engagement of the commercial industry, we would never be where we are today. We are so fortunate to have as good partners that they have stepped up to provide this technology to us. So I wholeheartedly endorse that.
Absolutely. Doctor?
Ranking Member Lucas, thank you for the comment. I agree with my colleague, Dr. Hensman. Public-private partnerships have worked well in many parts of our society. Arctic research should not stand alone as something where we don't encourage the public-private partnerships going forward. Industry is innovative. They move faster than government can move. Sometimes they're more innovative. Seated with federal research funds, we see that our nation's industry can lead in so many different sectors. I think it's probably part of our DNA, and it should be going forward. When you have a top-down nation that can dictate what happens within its nation, it's very hard. It's very easy to put resources in particular places. Our country is built differently. Our country is built to be inclusive. Our country is built to be innovative, and we should take advantage of these private industry. And as Dr. Hinzman noted, in so many different sectors, including satellite and fiber communications and telecommunications, in drones and marine assets, we should bring the whole team to the game because the Arctic is changing so fast. We have to bring the whole team to game. And if we can bring industry to the table, we can show them and provide an opportunity for them to make a profit in the North while serving the North. I think that would be a very good thing.
Dr. Hensman, as I mentioned in my statement, I had an opportunity to visit Summit Station back in 2017, and it was clear then that the facilities were inadequate for the world-class science being conducted there. Dr. Hensman, both you and Dr. Sfraga stated in your testimonies the importance of this facility and the need to recapitalize its outdated infrastructure. I know NOAA just upgraded the Barrow Atmospheric Baseline Observatory. Can you speak to any plans that are currently in motion to upgrade Summit Station?
Thank you, Ranking Member Lucas. I am so pleased that you were able to visit Summit Station, and I'm so pleased that you bring that to the attention of this committee. So that station is in dire need of maintenance and upgrades at this point. The surface melt has extended all the way to the summit. So that station is, over the past few years, is sinking into the ice, and it does need a serious upgrade. It does need serious investments to enable it to continue the important measurements that have been taken over the last 40 years, 50 years since that's been in operation. The role of Greenland in influencing our global climate dynamics just cannot be understated. It is so important. It affects the atmospheric circulation. It affects the oceanic properties. It affects ocean circulations. We have to continue those observations. Thank you.
Absolutely. Dr. Sfraga, could you please provide, because part of my responsibilities as a member of Congress is explaining to the folks back home why we make these investments. Could you provide one or two examples of how basic research funded by the federal government, science agencies like NSF, NOAA, and NASA play a role in national security decision-making in support of the Arctic? And along with that, what role does the U.S. Arctic Research Commission play in connecting defense and non-defense communities? I'm looking for a town meeting answer here.
Yeah, thank you, Member Lucas. I can say that, well, first of all, Greenland is emblematic of the New North. So many of the issues at play right now at the New North, whether it's social, political, economic, environmental. If you live in Norfolk, Virginia, or Nome, Alaska, you will feel the impacts of what happens in Greenland with the melting ice cap. But I can tell you that if you're interested in a national security component of research, here's where we're at. The United States needs to have a better idea of our domain. Why? Our Arctic domain is changing drastically. And if you are a resident citizen of our country, you need to know that Arctic research is a part of our national security. So securing money and resources for research secures our national security. If you're interested in homeland security, understanding full well that we have a great power competition underway in several different forms, Russia, China, even North Korea and other countries. The Arctic now is a globalized Arctic. It is not a place on a map far removed. It is now a part of geopolitics, which increases our dependence on so many different things like the ripple effect of global energy, global wheat supply and demand, global commodities, shipping costs. If you're shopping each day, you're being impacted by global commodities. So energy, resources, shipping, it can continue on and on. All facets of the economy now are woven into the Arctic. Whether we see that or not, it's really apparent to so many that that is the case.
I agree, Doctor. And yield back the balance of what time I do not have, Madam Chair.
All in good faith. And with that, we will hear from 5 minutes of questionings from the Distinguished Science Committee member, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you very much. This is such an important hearing, and I'm grateful to each of our witnesses for their important testimony. Pivoting to Mr. Lucas's question in the town hall meeting, it's worth noting that we have had some studies. One, Lawrence Livermore National Lab did a study in 2017, and just this year, the Pacific Northwest National Lab both linked wildfires in California to Arctic melting. The dry, hot conditions in California are directly linked. And so since we've learned these connections in our understanding, I guess the question is, what do we do? Can this information assist us as we prepare in the western continental United States for wildfires? It could be an early warning to help us better cope with that phenomena that we are seeing in Washington, Oregon, California, New Mexico, and the like. Yes, Doctor.
Thank you, Representative Lofgren. That's a very important issue, and one that I think our government is trying very hard to address. So there are several advances going on. Now, first, I'll take the broader picture with respect to the role of the Arctic in these increasing numbers of extreme events. You are absolutely correct. There are more severe, there's a greater frequency of extreme events and a greater severity of these extreme events, and that includes wildfire. And there is a role of the Arctic in influencing these global climate dynamics that are increasing these disastrous wildfires. So what are we doing about that? So there is now a new interagency ICAMS, Interagency Council on Advanced Meteorologic Services, excuse me. And one of the primary focuses of that is on addressing wildfire behavior, projecting where the wildfires will occur so we can be prepared for them, and then being able to better predict the wildfire behavior. And Iarpc is participating in that group to try and understand, to contribute what the Arctic's role is in that effort. But it is, I agree with you, that's a very important issue.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. Natali, as your statement described, the latest 6th assessment report for the first time included the permafrost carbon in the Earth systems models that informed the IPCC report, and we've made it clear much more is needed. How will this research impact to allow for a more accurate picture as we nationally determine contributions in carbon budgets around the world? How do you see that proceeding? You need to turn your mic on. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Lofgren. Yeah, so this is, thank you for this question. So first, I just want to talk briefly about these models, Earth system models. So Earth system models explain, how the climate is going to work, and it incorporates biogeochemistry, so carbon cycling, and it puts like human actions into that. Earth system models were not developed with the Arctic in mind. So things like permafrost and things like connection between the Arctic climate and the rest of the planet is not built into these models, and it's not trivial to build them into the models. And so this is one of the reasons why we have surprises like wildfires in the West, that currently, in order to be able to respond to these and be prepared for these, we need to improve these models. And that's a really challenging thing. It requires support from the top down for U.S. climate-based models to advance these. One of the key issues is the incorporation of permafrost carbon. Yes, in this last IPCC report, 2 of the models did incorporate permafrost carbon, certainly not fully, not in the way that we understand that permafrost thaws. And what this means is when we're thinking about how much carbon do we have available for humanity to stay below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're not hitting the mark. So even if all of the nations, put together a budget and we say, yes, we're going to keep to that, we're aiming for the wrong target right now. And so the very least that we need to do to start out with is to do our bookkeeping correctly, right? And we're not doing that bookkeeping correctly because the science isn't up to pace with the needs.
Well, I think that's very important. And as we look at the unfolding disaster around the world, it really does lead to how are we going to turn a corner on this if we don't accommodate in our models the carbon from the permafrost. And I would add the link to the wildfires. I mean, the forests burn, well, they're no longer capturing carbon, they're emitting carbon throughout the West. And unless we adjust our models to accommodate for that, and it's not obviously just here, it's around the world, we're not only going to miss the mark because of inaction, we're going to miss the mark because we haven't adequately set the mark. So my time is up, and I yield back, and I thank these witnesses for their tremendous testimony.
Thank you. And with that, we will hear from Mr. Posey for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens. Dr. Hensman, the National Science Foundation recently announced it was relying on Starlink satellite internet to support McMurdo station in Antarctica. That's a mouthful. Can you highlight how high-speed, low-latency satellite broadband systems like Starlink can enhance scientific efforts and connect research projects in the remote Arctic?
Absolutely. And I've been fortunate to be able to utilize that system in the past, and it is a remarkable boon to science in that it does provide access in very remote locations, provides quick, reliable access that can be used to collect data from stations that are not manned and that are left for long periods of time. It's an incredible asset that we are very fortunate to have. I understand that it's working very, very well in the Antarctic, and we do utilize it at several remote stations in the Arctic, and I think that it's such capability will enable our science to do more activities that we've never been able to achieve in the past, where we've had to have people in the process, in the field, to do that work. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Dr. Sfraga and Dr. Hinzman both on this one. With China increasing their scientific missions to the Arctic, which we know are frequently dual use, what is the U.S. doing to counter their influence in the region and within international bodies such as the Arctic Council?
Thank you, Representative. Indeed, China's playing the game Go around the world, the classic board game Go. The Arctic is a part of that game for them. They simply want to influence the political landscape and exert their will around the globe. We see that in a lot of their hard and soft power investments. Certainly research is one of them. They now have the ability to indigenously build their own icebreakers. They have a relationship with the Russian Federation that allows them domain awareness in the Arctic. We see their expeditions in the Arctic navigating the Arctic Ocean in a way that is research-based, but could be dual use and multi-use as well. The best counter to that, obviously, we can get into the national security side of this. I guess the best possible counter to that is to ensure that the United States leads in Arctic research as well. That means that we have the ice-breaking capacity, the research capacity in the north, and we have something that China and Russia, frankly, do not have, and that is a set of partners and allies that are in the Arctic and outside of the Arctic that are too have incredible amount of expertise in Arctic research. And this, if there ever was a time to double down, to invest more in Arctic research, more in our presence in the Arctic, more of our research capacity in the Arctic, and a better leveraging and integration with our partners around the North, I think now is the time because of what you just mentioned, Representative, and that is that both Russia and China do see the Arctic as an opportunity for a number of things, including more presence and influence in the North, along with, of course, basic research that can be used for other goals and motives that they might have.
That was great. Dr. Hensman, you want to add to that?
I think Dr. Sfraga was very eloquent in his assessment. I do share our concerns that have been expressed with respect to the Chinese advancements into the Arctic. They are developing stations in collaborations with the Russians. They are incredibly investing into Arctic research, and just as they're doing in many other parts of the globe. So their long-term motives and their short-term actions are of great concern to our government, and I appreciate the caution and the concern that our government has put forth with respect to these actions. Thank you, Representative Posey.
Yeah, same two witnesses. With Russia currently chairing the Arctic Council, has this hampered the ability for international cooperation? Like, what efforts has Russia made to cooperate with China concerning research?
So I'll take the first crack really quickly, Dr. Sfraga. So yes, that has had a serious impact on collaborative research. The United States government has ceased federal collaborations in Arctic science. I am disappointed to see this impact to science, but I fully support this action of the U.S. government. So Dr. Sfraga?
I agree with Dr. Hinzman, fully support the actions that the United States and our other 6 partners in the Arctic Council have taken. It has hindered research in the Arctic. If you're trying to put together a puzzle and you only have half the pieces, you really don't have a great shot at completing a good picture of the puzzle. And you've just taken out Russia, which is 50% of the Arctic. So many of the issues we've just talked about, whether it's fire, permafrost thaw, ocean acidification, all of the issues facing all of the Arctic, which means the globe, we've just parked 50% of the Arctic to the side. Having said that, I am in full agreement with the actions that the United States and our other nations have taken. It has hindered our ability to have solid international cooperation. The Arctic has prided itself, for good reason, for being a zone of peace and cooperation, even through the Cold War. However, the invasion of Ukraine is beyond the pale. And so what best to do now? What best to do now is to work with our allies and partners and double down on our investments right now so that we can leverage the expertise of our allies in a way that we can continue the research that needs to be done at a time of dramatic change. But make no mistake, it really will hinder our research and our understanding of the North more fully. But we can't be held hostage to what has happened. We have to move forward, and we're lucky enough to have allies and partners to move forward with.
I thank the witnesses, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for letting them finish answering that question, and I yield back.
Absolutely. And with that, we were going to hear from one of Oregon's finest, Congresswoman Bonamici, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you to the chair and ranking member and to our witnesses. Experts predict that by the end of the century, hundreds of towns, cities, and villages across the United States and around the world will be all or partially underwater. I'm grateful we're having this hearing today to amplify the role of the Arctic and, as it says, strengthening science to respond to a rapidly changing Arctic. And I hope that what we're hearing today, the solutions that we find in this committee and in this Congress, meet the moment with the gravity of what we're hearing today. Dr. Hensman, you talked about the infrastructure needs for Arctic researchers and adaptations along shorelines, or they're typically in gray solutions like concrete or green solutions such as absorbing floodwaters in urban areas. So will you please elaborate on how priorities are set regarding adaptation that's needed for the infrastructure to support researchers? And I know Ranking Member Lucas asked about research facilities, but if you could also mention the challenges of travel now and how that is changed in light of the thawing permafrost.
Thank you, Representative Bonamici. Again, excellent questions. And so the way the priorities are set, we exist, Iarpc collaborations, Iarpc exist to facilitate the collaborations, the partnerships with the federal agencies and with non-federal partners. And so we've gone to great effort to to solicit input from the federal agencies, what the urgent research needs are, but also from the Arctic communities, from the individuals, from indigenous organizations, and from the state of Alaska. So we've identified those urgent priorities that must be identified, and then worked with the federal agencies, the indigenous communities to try and understand the best approach to address these urgent priorities. As far as what the urgent needs are and the priority approaches to address the rising climate, or I'm sorry, the rising sea levels, that is a huge challenge, which requires, again, as Dr. Sfraga was talking about, huge international collaborations and partnership to address. We're seeing remarkable degradations of glaciers around the world, which in the past several decades, it's been primarily the glaciers that have contributed to the sea level rise. And now we're facing the incredible degradation of Greenland and the losses from the Antarctic. It is a tremendous problem. What we're trying to do now is just trying to characterize, best understand what that sea level rise is going to be over what time so that we can help our communities adapt. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Hinzman. I want to ask Ms. Metcalf, welcome. You discussed the importance of better connection between Indigenous knowledge and what you refer to as the science research government industry. One issue mentioned is a mismatch or disconnect that's harmful algal blooms or HABs, which with warming temperatures are creating a new threat to the Arctic. This is an issue that I've worked on a bipartisan basis, particularly with Representative Posey over the years. In fact, we just recently received a GAO report about the Interagency NOAA EPA work group confirming that we need to do more. So Ms. Metcalf, what are your suggestions for addressing that disconnect so that you can access the reliable testing you need for the water and for the food you eat that comes from the ocean?
Well, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. One of the issues that we constantly deal with is that our communities are well adapted to providing biological samples to science who can do the assessment of if it's safe to eat some of our food resources. The problem is that sometimes it's very, very difficult to get results back in a timely manner back to our communities who harvest bowhead whales and Pacific walrus and ice seals and birds. Is it safe to eat these resources? When we don't get any results back in a timely manner, although our communities have been providing samples for many, many years, that's the issue that we have. How can we incorporate Indigenous knowledge, local input in adapting or mitigating coastal erosion, for example, that was mentioned, or changes along our coastline? How can we incorporate our knowledge into these issues that we've been—
Thank you. And Ms. Metcalf, I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to get one more question in. My time's running out. Quickly, no Dr. Natale, you testified in the Foreign Affairs Committee you mentioned last year. And then in your testimony today, you said less than 1 year later, we've discovered that the negative consequences of inaction are much higher than we previously understood. What happened in the last year?
Could you please turn—
Sorry about that. Continuously surprised by the rapidity of the changes and the interactions that are happening. And I'd say this storm that happened in Alaska is not a surprise, but it was a surprise, and it's something that I think we need to be continuously prepared for. And I think what's happening now is that I think the climate is actually changing faster than the science can happen. And so what that means is that we're seeing extreme events both in the Arctic and also in lower latitudes as a result of the rapid Arctic changes that are happening. And these extreme events are impacting Arctic residents and also the rest of the planet.
I appreciate that. And I see my time has expired. Thank you to the witnesses for your excellent answers. I yield back.
Okay, and with that, we will move to Ms. Bice for 5 minutes of questioning from the great state of Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I want to say thank you to the witnesses for joining us for this discussion today. Dr. Natale, in your bio, you mentioned that you had testified to the Foreign Affairs Committee about some of the challenges with the changes with the Arctic and particularly Greenland ice shelf. Do you want to maybe expand a little bit? As someone who sits on the Armed Services Committee, certainly national security is something that I take very seriously. Can you talk a little bit, since some of the other witnesses have broached the topic, what are your perspectives on these changes and how it impacts our national security?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there's very direct impacts when you think about the changes that are happening on the ground, and so I focus a lot on permafrost thaw, but permafrost thaw does not happen independent from the rest of the system. So these changes that are happening on lands in the Arctic are impacting communities that live in the Arctic, but also military facilities and other infrastructure, gas and oil pipelines. And so I'm talking about ground collapsing when the ice and the permafrost melts and the ground starts to collapse. That in turn then causes flooding and increases coastal erosion and makes infrastructure more vulnerable to storm damage. And so this is a very direct impact. And I guess I would say another priority that needs to be a focus when we're thinking about, I guess, security. I guess I would also really want to highlight security of human systems and food security and food sovereignty, because this is also being impacted not only by permafrost thaw, but by the number of other changes that are happening across the Arctic. And I think others on this panel can speak more directly to that from their personal and professional experiences. But the impact of the climate changes on both the human communities, the infrastructure, the economic impacts that it's happening are far and wide reaching beyond the Arctic.
And to follow up on that, and this is actually for Ms. Metcalf or Dr. Hensman, aside from the release of the carbon and methane emissions, are there any other threats from thawing permafrost that could potentially pose a threat to local or global communities' health? And can you gauge the seriousness of those?
Thank you for that question. Yes, sinkholes are just something new that is happening in our region. We see that because moose hunting just ended, but hunters are reporting large sinkholes along the roads that are affecting our ability to harvest these resources that are very important to us.
If I may add, thank you for that question, Representative Weiss. If I may add, it is a very important issue for national security in that in the Arctic, all of our military facilities are built upon permafrost, which is also degrading, so the infrastructure is at risk. And we need to develop better techniques to improve our design criteria and our construction techniques so that the facilities that are built are functional throughout their projected lifespan. So we have to come up with better building techniques, and we have to come up with better design criteria.
That's a great, I think, perspective there. And this is to all of the witnesses. Given the harsh environment in the Arctic, can you talk about the need to invest in Arctic technology that is developed to remain operational and sustainable under these extreme circumstances? We've talked a little bit, and I know that we're putting together sort of this holistic view, but what are some of the technologies you think are really maybe crucial currently?
May I?
Please.
So thank you again for that question. So I think what we need to do, the mistakes we've made in the past is that when we were building facilities, pipelines, roads, we built upon the historic weather data. We didn't look forward. We weren't using climate projections to understand how the environment was going to change and to build our facilities, to design our infrastructure to last for that design criteria. So what we need to do, we need to use climate models to integrate with our building techniques, with the engineering designs, so that these facilities are appropriate for the environmental conditions they're going to see throughout their lifespan. And that's something we're not doing now, but we really need to.
May I add?
Yes, Ms. Mack.
Yes, Indigenous knowledge and local perspectives need to be included in these plans. So that's very important to consider. So thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes my time. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And with that, we will hear from Congressman McNerney for 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, I think the chairwoman, you didn't say anything about California, so I'll live with that.
From the wonderful state of California, the jovial state of California.
Thank you. Well, I thank the witnesses. Dr. Hensman, the Arctic Observing Network is a system of atmospheric, land, and ocean-based environmental monitoring capabilities. Data is received from ocean buoys, satellites, and other sources. How would you characterize the current state of Arctic monitoring, observing, and modeling in the prediction efforts?
Our observing system in the Arctic is very, very sparse at this point. And so as far as the role that it plays in observing and predicting, it's tenuous at best, in that our models are developed, our models require validation, verification, and it is very difficult with the extent of the observations that we have now to really rigorously validate those models. And so it does hurt our ability for even short-term predictions with respect to weather predictions, which has a big impact on the more temperate regions, but also with respect to the long-term projections of future climates.
Is there an opportunity to fill in those gaps?
I certainly hope so. We are trying to enhance and improve the observing network in collaborations with many of our international colleagues, with their other institutions, other governments. We are trying to build a reliable, robust Arctic observing network.
Thank you. Dr. Natali, a top priority of the Permafrost Pathways is to fill in the gaps, again, and monitoring greenhouse gas emissions across the Arctic. What are your recommendations of a carbon flux monitoring network?
Thank you for this question. So as part of the Permafrost Pathways project, we're trying to fill in gaps in carbon cycling on land from the Arctic so that we can know now, is the Arctic a carbon source or a sink as it has been? So is it continuing to take up carbon as it has been for thousands of years, and what will this look like into the future? One of the challenges we've recognized are these major gaps, and so we're taking I'd say a top-down approach, saying if you want to know the carbon budget of the Arctic, where would you strategically put these monitoring sites? And I feel like in terms of Arctic carbon cycling, that hasn't happened in the past. Sites generally get established somewhat opportunistically by grants. And so I think that kind of more coordinated effort, there is a challenge right now because we cannot be working on the ground in Russia. I think another major need here in order to help us to fill this gap is this satellite data. So right now, high resolution satellite data is critical for seeing place in the Arctic that we can't access on the ground. Some of the commercial data right now is only accessible if you're an NSF or a NASA-funded scientist. Well, accessible, I would say, like for free. So making these data widely available and beyond the funding cycles would greatly advance the scientific community's ability to continue monitoring these sites, even in places, and to get the ground truth data, even from satellites, in order to verify these models. And I'd say the last thing we need is really dedicated commitment towards improving these models. There are a number of US-based Earth system models that could use that support.
Well, has there been any research on how solar radiation management, for example, by injecting sunlight reflecting particles into the stratosphere, would slow the permafrost thawing?
I think there are a lot of challenges with this, and solar radiation management. I think I'm not opposed to exploring all options, but I would strongly suggest that conversation is that Indigenous Arctic residents are brought into the room and others as a part of that.
Anyone else on the panel want to take that? Dr. Hensman?
Yes, thank you for that question. So there has been extensive discussion within the Arctic research community, within the whole scientific community, as far as geoengineering. And at present, the United States does not support research into geoengineering as far as any of those activities. We're more concerned about the possible consequences. But there are right now active investigations going on into potential modeling studies to try and understand that if that occurred, what the consequences would be.
That was my question. Thank you. Well, major changes in the Arctic can be seen within a single generation now. We're seeing that happen. And I don't have time to ask anyone specifically, but I'll throw the question out there before I retire. How will the biennial implementation approach for the Arctic Research Plan impact research effectiveness? And with that, I'll yield back.
Well, thank you. And as I had passed the 5 minutes of questioning over to my colleague who has served this committee very admirably, I did so with a lot of admiration. And, you know, the remaining weeks that we have of this, months that we have of this term, it's just been such an honor to serve with my friend and colleague, Jerry. And with that, we're going to pass it over to Mr. Feenstra of Iowa for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Lucas, and thank you all to our witnesses for your testimony and sharing your extensive experience and knowledge on this subject. There's been a lot of research on the Arctic, and that can be very important, but we should build off what we've already done. For example, the DOE's Biological and Environmental Research Program used drones to conduct high-resolution monitoring for changes in the Arctic vegetation. There was also collaboration between the DOE and the NSF to study microbes in Arctic soil that can absorb carbon dioxide as well as adapted to take advantage of the thawing of permafrost. So my question is this, Dr. Sfraga, can you tell us more about incorporating these terrestrial research investments with the Arctic? And are there studies and data produced by agriculture and life sciences research like Iowa State University that can also be used in the new Arctic research?
Thank you, Representative Feenstra. Yeah, the answer is yes. I think where your comments and your questions are coming from is there a better way to integrate and leverage what we already have invested as a country, not just in financial resources, but in our intellectual capacities and capabilities? There's a way to feed that into the more broader Arctic research endeavor. And the answer is yes, because the systems are connected. This is a globalized Arctic now. So if we're doing research in Iowa on the hydro cycle, if we're doing research on vegetation, water cycles, if we're looking at pestilence, migrations, all of those issues, since the global patterns have changed, we can see the benefit of understanding what the impacts are across our country and indeed across the world. So if there are assets like drones being used, if there's research, as you have noted on microbial research endeavors, then I think there is a way, and there are ways to leverage those areas of expertise and show the interconnectedness, the cause and effect, the impacts of what's happening in the Arctic to places around the world, including crop yield and
yeah, can I further ask that question of, so I'm an academic myself. How do we get more involvement in the academic world in this arena? Dr. Sheriff.
Yep. Thank you again for that. I think there's an understanding, as fellow scholars, there's an understanding that standards are tied, and we're seeing more and more institutions, whether they be in Iowa or in Florida or in California, have increased capacity and interest in the Arctic, and that is where one scholar may have had a particular focus in their area, and that might have been a region outside of the Arctic. And now we're seeing the transfer of their intellectual capacities and their research to the Arctic and even in the Antarctic as well. So we see a lot of this reference and transition of their work to the region. It comes with scholarship, it comes with publications, it comes with conferences, but it also comes with the understanding throughout the Arctic community and throughout the academic community that these global systems are indeed tied.
Absolutely.
We're seeing the cause and effect of it.
Yep. Thank you for that. So Iowa State also recently received an award from NSF for the project entitled Collaborative Research towards Resilient Water Infrastructure in Alaska Native Communities through Knowledge and Co-Production. One of the major research objectives for this grant will be to outreach efforts aimed at training community members in the use of water supply and leak detection sensing equipment. Ms. Metcalf, from your perspective, how receptive are Alaskan indigenous communities to implementing federal research ideas like this? So it's coming out of the academic world, so how do we apply it and how do we implement it based on the community members that are out there?
Yes, thank you for that comment and question. We have a similar project here that we are doing called Search that is funded by NSF, and it utilizes our 12 IK experts in that project that is looking at health, policy, and knowledge systems within the Arctic to conduct that project. So I think I keep emphasizing Indigenous knowledge, the use of and incorporating that in any kind of project is important. So thank you. I hope I answered that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your comments. I'm very grateful for each of one of your testimonies, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from North Carolina. Representative Ross, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member, and thank you so much to all of the witnesses for your testimony. I recently returned from a climate and energy meeting with several members of Congress. It was bipartisan in Iceland. And we looked at geothermal energy, we looked at carbon capture, and we talked to a wide variety of people in Iceland working in both climate and energy. One of the biggest takeaways that we took from that trip was how there were many, many women involved in energy and climate. And for some of the largest companies dealing with these issues, 50% of the board of directors. And of course, we have a female prime minister of Iceland who's in DC this week. And so one of the focuses of this committee has been increasing the STEM pipeline so that we can have many different perspectives and talents addressing the most difficult problems that we have. And so I wanted to know what the STEM education and workforce needs are in the Arctic, including supporting the continuity of Indigenous knowledge, and what are the challenges?
Who would you direct that question to, please?
To anyone, you can start.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question. So I'll certainly jump in and then perhaps pass it to my colleagues. So Iarpc, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, has recently released the Arctic Research Plan. A component of that plan, one of the foundational activities of that plan is, of course, STEM education. That is very important to us. So we are, and another component of it is Indigenous engagement and participatory research and Indigenous leadership in research. And part of that is we want to utilize the co-production of knowledge. We want to gain from the expertise and the culture that exists, but we also want to improve the capacity of in the communities so that they can address the issues and take these challenges on themselves. And STEM education is a critical part of that. And so we've been directed by the agencies to address that to the best of our abilities, and we are definitely trying to respond. Thank you.
And Ms. Metcalf, I would love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you for that question. I am a big proponent of co-production of knowledge. I would suggest including Indigenous knowledge, our local communities from the beginning of any project development. I think we always have been part of the solution, so it's very important to note that. Thank you.
Does anyone else have anything to add before I ask my next question? Okay, my next question, right before we went to Iceland, President Biden announced that he's interested in creating a position of ambassador to the Arctic. I know that we've talked a lot about the international challenges in the Arctic. I'd like any reaction that any of the panelists have to that, and how you see dealing with climate and science as a role for whoever that ambassador might be. And why don't we start with Dr. Hensman and then anybody else who wants to chime in.
So the United States is one of the very few Arctic nations that does not have an Arctic ambassador. So we are very pleased to learn of this new announcement. And I think that there are some wonderful people who can really play a great role for us in facilitating these engagements we need with our other Arctic nations partners. And so this is a great step forward, particularly at this time when we've ceased the active engagement of the Arctic Council. So this is a critical role at this time, and I'll pass the floor from that. Thank you.
And I guess
Representative Ross, I would just, please.
Okay, I guess I'll just quickly add, I think from a science perspective, the climate and the changes that are happening don't see national boundaries. And so I think this is really a critical point in helping us to advance the science across the Arctic outside of the US as well.
Great. Dr. Sfraga?
Thank you, Representative Ross. I too think that it's a very good idea for the United States to create this ambassador position. I see the role as someone who can project and reflect U.S. policy across the board to international partners, especially at this time, as Dr. Natali just noted, someone who can communicate in aggregate all of the U.S. policies, can communicate where we stand on many issues across the board. One office, one individual with support that can do that for all of our interests in the North. Would be not only something good for the United States, but I think our allies and partners too are awaiting someone like this as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kansas, Representative LaTurner. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all of our conferees. Dr. Hinzman, how are the goals for the current Arctic Research Plan, how do the goals for the current Arctic Research Plan improve on previous iterations of the plan? And are you concerned that overly broad priority areas will make substantive change difficult?
So that's an excellent question. This plan is very different from previous plans. And I think it's taken a new approach because this is where we are with respect to the science. Previous plans were really focused upon understanding the disciplinary sciences, looking at sea ice processes or permafrost dynamics or ecosystem evolution. At this point, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take on the more complex, the more sophisticated societal level questions of health and community resilience and economies, livelihoods, risk management, hazard mitigation. Those are areas where we need to draw together the many disciplines of science, the many components of science, but also engineering and economics and the other policy issues so that we can address these higher level questions, these more sophisticated questions that can't be taken on from a more basic disciplinary perspective.
Can you talk about the economic change that occurs in Arctic communities and how that influences your goal setting for the Iarpc?
Yes, unfortunately, Arctic communities have very limited economic opportunities. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand how we can, what the research components, what research can add to understanding sustainable livelihoods, how we can help communities understand what their resources are, how they can utilize them to best move forward to maintain a thriving community into the future. And so we're really looking at the economies of the resources, but also the human resources and the capital and the capabilities and the culture that they have, how we can pull all of this information together to make sustainable, thriving communities.
Thank you. Dr. Sfraga, how could collaboration be improved between U.S. Arctic Research Commission and other government agencies to promote research in Arctic communities?
Well, thank you for the question, Representative. We do that a great deal now. There's a lot of communication between the Arctic Research Commission, our commissioners. They're representative of 5 of the 7 commissioners are Alaskans. They each have different seats on the commission. So there's a lot of integration and a lot of communication between the commission and communities throughout the state of Alaska. So that's one. 2 is that we spend our days communicating throughout the state of Alaska with the government, with indigenous groups, with state commissioners, but also with our federal partners as well. Most of the work of the commission is not creating a 2-year goals report. Most of the work of the commission is exactly what you note, Representative, which is communicating to communities and having communities communicate to the commissioners to inform our work, and then work with our federal partners as well as our international partners.
I appreciate that. I want to stick with you. And this is really important. How does the United States use research and development programs as soft diplomacy tools to build relationships with our allies?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I would say that, let me give you I'll give you one example. Research has always been a part of the U.S. soft diplomacy, always, and it's a bedrock of what we do. If you look at the Arctic and you think about it in arcs, just in these arcs to and from the Arctic, there's an arc of, I would say, commonality and an arc of cooperation in the North American Arctic. That's Alaska, the United States, Canada, Greenland. And by looking at that tranche of North American Arctic, you can see many research projects that span the Arctic with like-minded nations that already have working relationships in research, from Greenland, as noted, to our bilateral relationship with Canada and Alaska through the United States. So by reinforcing those areas, that's reinforcing a rules-based order. It's reinforcing a transatlantic alliance and the transatlantic partnerships as you think about this arc of commonality that goes into the Nordics and into Europe. So this is the ties that bind us. Research is a bedrock of that partnership and those ties that bind us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your answers. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And with that, we are going to hear from Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you to Madam Chair, so Chair Johnson and Chair Stevens and Ranking Member Lucas, thank you for hosting us today. And to the witnesses, thank you for being here to provide great insight. The consequences of a rapidly changing Arctic landscape have the potential to impact billions of people worldwide. Alaskan residents and countless indigenous communities, however, are already on the front lines of the most observable impacts of climate change, such as thawing permafrost. As global temperatures continue to rise, millions of lives and critical civilian and military infrastructure in the Arctic are urgently at risk. So, Dr. Natali, we know that when permafrost thaws, enormous quantities of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane are released into the atmosphere, not to mention the ancient bacteria and viruses that could trigger another global pandemic. How are increasingly frequent extreme weather events speeding up permafrost thaw, and what are the immediate and long-term consequences of abrupt thaw events?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Representative Tonko. So abrupt climate events like heat waves, like these massive storms that we're seeing, can trigger rapid permafrost thaw, the sinkholes that Ms. Metcalf had mentioned. And when this rapid events happen, so when the ground thaws, it can happen very gradually, where you have heat being transferred, but you can also have these rapid events happening, particularly in areas where you have a lot of ice in the ground. Once those happen, then you have more ground exposed, so it can happen faster and faster and faster. So rapid events that trigger it then cause this exponential increase in the rate of permafrost thaw. Once that happens, it's essentially irreversible, at least on a human-relevant time frame. It's taken a long time for the carbon, thousands of years in many cases, for the carbon to get into the ground. When you have this massive erosion, even if we cool our climate, you're not going to get the shorelines back that have eroded. And so these triggering events can, even though they're happening perhaps on a smaller spatial scale, can have outsized impacts both on global climate and on the ground for people who are living on permafrost and the infrastructure that's on permafrost.
So that being said, how does this impact on accurate pictures for nationally determining contributions and carbon budgets?
Yeah, so that's the challenge, because right now permafrost is rarely included in global climate models and rarely incorporated into these budgets for how much carbon is remaining to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. These abrupt events are absolutely not included at all. They're quite complex to put into a model. We can make estimates of it, and I strongly suggest that using the best information that you have at hand. There are a number of models, and my group is one of them, working on advancing the models to incorporate these abrupt events. But when we're thinking about analyzing and responding to risk, I think we need to really seriously consider these upper extremes that we're being pushed to that we perhaps haven't been able to consider in kind of the traditional models that we've been running.
And can you elaborate on your approach to collaborative research with Alaska Native tribes?
Yeah, so as part of a new project that I'm leading called Permafrost Pathways, we'll be working with 10 tribes in Alaska who are making really difficult decisions about climate change adaptation as a result of permafrost thaw, flooding, and erosion. And so my approach for going into this really is to let the tribes lead the research that's needed. So what I do when I'm there is based on what their needs are. And so yes, my specialty may be in permafrost science, but if the needs come out that, you know, there's the ground is sinking and this is then impacting water quality, then I try to make this happen. And as Ms. Metcalf mentioned, there's been a real challenge for the tribes getting information back to them. So any information that is collected, it belongs to the tribe, it's driven by the tribe, and it's for their information in terms of helping them making decisions for moving forward.
Thank you. And my time is just about up, but I'll ask that all of our witnesses consider any recommendations that you could share with us as a committee for making federal funding more accessible for Arctic research, and perhaps provide that to us in writing since I have just seconds remaining. Okay, with that, I yield back. Madam Chair.
Well, thank you to our very dedicated committee member, Mr. Tonko, for those 5 minutes of questioning. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Ms. Kim for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today and answering our questions and, you know, discussing this very important topic. I know you just talked about, Dr. Natali, about the permafrost emissions and all that. So, but for my better understanding, I want to continue on that line of questioning. In your testimony, you call for increasing data coverage in space and time and better connecting the measuring and modeling communities to reduce uncertainty in climate monitoring and modeling. So in recent years, we have seen the innovative carbon and methane emission detection technologies come forward in the oil and gas sector. So can you talk more about the Woodwell Climate Research Center, how it is leveraging new and emerging technologies like these to improve permafrost emissions tracking as well as those barriers to deploying those technologies?
Yeah, thank you, Representative Kim, for your question. One of the challenges of working in the Arctic is that it's dark and it's cloudy, and this makes it a real challenge for using some types of satellites to detect changes that are happening on land. The other issue with using satellite data, say, for detecting greenhouse gas emissions from thawing permafrost is that they're currently tuned to detect peaks, very, very high spikes, that say, that may be coming out of the gas and oil industry, less so tuned for this very, very large area where emissions from a very, you know, one area itself may be relatively low, but it's this sort of cumulative effect over this large area. And so that's one of the real big challenges and barriers, say, for using remote technology for detecting what's happening on the ground, which is why we are working to set up on-the-ground monitoring, and then we use satellite data to, what we say, upscale that information. And then we are also working to link that information into process models to make sure that the monitoring the modeling are communicating with each other, because that currently, surprisingly, is not the case. The scientific communities tend to kind of get separated when we're working by discipline and also just by methodology. And so this is key for us. It's called data model assimilation. It was a process that's used by the weather forecasting community. It's made our weather forecasts much better. And so we're working on a new data model assimilation framework for carbon cycling for the Arctic.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask the next question to all three doctors, Hensman, Sfraga, and Dr. Natali. In your testimonies, you also emphasize the need for international research and scientific collaboration in the Arctic, and you also share concerns regarding the barriers to future science collaboration and explicit restrictions on data sharing and financing of foreign investigators, right? So in your opinion, how can we best navigate those transnational collaboration on scientific and advancement in the Arctic amid the ongoing geopolitical tensions as well as future conflicts that may rise? And how do we balance protecting our U.S. national security and our allies and promoting scientific collaboration with adversaries like Russia?
Thank you, Representative Kim. That's, again, an excellent question. So I would like to go back to what Dr. Sfraga said earlier, and I'm sorry if I steal your thunder, Mike, but the collaborative research that we've had with our international partners has been just a cornerstone of our international relationships, of our partnerships. And so even now, we anticipate, we expect, we hope that this conflict in Ukraine will end. And following that the scientific collaborations will, again, open the door for better scientific relationships and hopefully better policy relationships among our nations. At the same time, we must protect our intellectual properties, we must protect our capabilities, but we can also benefit by sharing our expertise and sharing our understanding. And so hopefully these partnerships, these collaborations can open that door for that better policy relationships.
Sure. Would you like to chime in?
Data sharing is, I have to say, has been a problem for a long time now. As a US-funded scientist, all of my data are publicly shared. That's required from the Arctic Funding Agency. It's very challenging to get data from other nations, and I would say particularly Russia, and this has been for a while now. So the solution to that, I don't know what the solution to that is. You know, as a scientist, I work one-on-one with other scientists, and we collaborate and we share data. At some point, it would be great to see a top-down efforts to encourage data sharing, to encourage, bringing equipment in and out across nations is also another challenge. So just really recognizing sort of that these boundaries are creating a barrier for scientists trying to work across the Arctic and to come up with a pan-Arctic answer to some of these issues.
Do we have time to listen from? Okay. Dr. Sfraga, would you like to chime in?
Oh, thank you very much. I'll hopefully make this brief. Again, encouraging the international cooperation with allies and partners, as I noted before, but we should not underestimate the power that and expertise that other countries bring to the table. Countries that believe in a rules-based order like Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom. The EU has a Horizons Europe program with a significant investment being made in Arctic research. In aggregate, when you look at all of that together with the United States in a leadership role here, you can leverage the expertise and focus the Arctic research that needs to get done, not just for a nation state, but also for the entire Arctic region. By encouraging that, by the U.S. Communicating its interest in continued leadership, but also these international cooperations and partnerships, I think that will be responded to well, but also with U.S. leadership areas in which we believe to be important. I know many other nations do as well, and encouraging these international partnerships going forward would be helpful. I would also note that the United States is a part of an international science cooperation agreement signed through the Arctic Council that has been helpful, but it has not solved the problem of at least data and assets crossing borders, as Dr. Natali has noted. But it is helpful to know that there is an agreement in place. It will not help us with information in and out of Russia at the moment, but the international community continues to try to think pan-Arctic.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to hear from Dr. Foster for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. Ms. Metcalf, I have some questions related to sort of demographic trends, particularly in Inuit areas. Are the Inuit areas, for example, facing the same sort of, in Russia, facing the same sort of demographic collapse that the rest of Russia is facing? Or is there a fairly uniform situation around the Arctic? And how are these demographic trends likely to be impacted by climate change? And what's the sort of range of opinion on how to support the population under different climate scenarios going forward? Has there been, scenario planning done for what the future will look like, depending on how well we deal with this?
Well, I hope so. Thank you for that question. The Arctic Council has stated that the Arctic should be a conflict-free zone. So that's what we hope would be emphasized. The Inuit Circumpolar Council, which is a permanent participant to the Arctic Council, recognizes that and really emphasized that the Arctic is supposed to be a conflict-free zone. We do have people across the waters that are our family and friends and neighbors and that are living in the Russia's Chukotka Peninsula. We maintain that relationship despite the differences or despite the politics. We hope that research and continue to be conducted because we share the same resources that they do. Marine mammals have no boundaries, but we have that very straight region that separates us. So I hope this is a good answer for you. Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Natali, you mentioned relocation as, what sort of scenario planning has been done for relocation if, we have 5 or 50 feet of sea level rise? What does that do? Has that been looked at in any detail about how this is going to play out?
I think on the federal level, there perhaps might be others here who may want to comment on this, but my understanding of this is that there's limited federal governance framework for addressing relocation and other adaptation needs related to climate change in the Arctic or anywhere else in this country. So I think this is something that is a very high priority. This would involve teams of Arctic residents, of scientists, decision makers, engineers, and policymakers, because right now, in addition to the really difficult environmental challenges that are happening, there are major policy barriers to communities who are having to make these decisions about how to protect themselves from the changes that are happening right now.
Yeah. Dr. Hensman, are there something you could?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question, Representative Foster. Community relocation is very important in Alaska right now. There are, the GAO did a report on the number of communities threatened. I believe it was 23 communities are actively being threatened right now by coastal erosion or riverine erosion. Many of those communities are actively considering relocation or actively making plans. And so they are working with several of our federal agencies. The Corps of Engineers is playing a very important role, the Denali Commission, Housing and Urban Development. There is a very formal and coordinated process that is going forward to help these communities consider relocation. But it is, as Dr. Natali said, it does begin with the community. The community must come together to decide if that is in their best interest, if that is what they want to do, and then to determine the locations that would be suitable for it. And it is, as Dr. Natali did, I agree 100%, it is such a complicated issue revolving biological sciences, economics, social science, engineering, and so it's a very difficult process. But we are fortunate right now that many of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act is helpful. There are resources available, and I do believe also that the IRA will also be beneficial in this regard. Thank you.
Now, one of the areas where we have, I guess, sort of diverged from Russia is that they're continuing to work and develop and produce nuclear icebreakers, which are, of course, much more. They're actually one of the technologies where nuclear reactors are really valuable. And then, is that something that we suffer from a lot by not having that capability in research?
So Russia has many nuclear icebreakers, and they are currently planning on building more. And actually, as Dr. Sfraga mentioned earlier, China has 2 icebreakers, and they're trying to develop a 3rd nuclear icebreaker. Nuclear icebreakers do have incredibly more power. The United States research community has partnered with Russian icebreakers in the past to do some midwinter research into the deep ice, and so it does limit our capabilities. There are, of course, many other considerations besides the value of the research or the access, and so that's a more complex question than I'm capable of answering.
All right, thank you. My time is up, and I'll yield back.
All right, we're going to turn to Mr. Byer for 5 minutes of questioning from the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. And thank you for this incredibly important discussion and hearing. Dr. Natali, you make the really powerful case about the dangers of the permafrost melting. That it has 4 times the amount of carbon that humans have released since the Industrial Revolution, twice as much carbon as is in the Earth's atmosphere right now. And you had a number of recommendations that, the first was about lengthening the grant periods from the 3-year cycle to much longer. But overall, almost all the recommendations were about greater investment in the science, climate monitoring, research planning, data exchange, grant funding. Is there anything we can actually do, not just study, but do to slow or stop the permafrost thaw right now?
Thank you, Representative Byer. That's a really great question. I mean, the number one priority, I guess I would say, is to, we've taken great steps in the U.S. for reducing and planning to reduce our fossil fuel emissions, but I think the main message is that needs to be greatly ramped up if we actually want to keep global climate below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think we also need to recognize that we've already committed to a lot of changes in the Arctic, and so the emphasis on understanding the science, I think, is really critical in order for planning and for risk assessment and for understanding both what's happening now, but what's happening in a year and 10 years and 50 years and 100 years. So I think, I think that the Arctic is a challenge because really it's a global problem. Greenhouse gas emissions from thawing permafrost impact everywhere else on the planet, but at the same time, protection of forests, keeping carbon in agricultural soils, reducing fossil fuel emissions, all of these things will impact permafrost. And, permafrost can refreeze. There are some changes that are happening that are irreversible. The carbon that's coming out are irreversible on a human time frame. These abrupt events that are happening, but we're not at a point where we can't decide the future. We can certainly reduce the amount of permafrost that will thaw by sort of greatly increasing our ambition for mitigation.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hensman, you wrote that we have had no choice but to forego the regular collegial communication that enriched our understanding of Arctic science since the thawing of the Cold War because of the war in Ukraine. Dr. Sfraga had made the same comment. I think that Dr. Natali the same. We're still working with Russia on the International Space Station. We know how horrific and upsetting the war in Ukraine is, but we also know that the melting of the permafrost could change not just tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives, but billions of lives on Earth. Is there no case to be made that this should be the one area where we continue to work with Russia?
Thank you, sir. That is such a difficult question, and there is no good answer. In that the threats to democracy and the suffering in Europe are almost terrible in comparison. And so in comparison, the setback to the science is hard to place it on the same scale. I do understand what you're saying as far as looking at the long-term threats to humanity with respect to the changing climate. And so that I guess I don't believe that we can forsake our approach with respect to ceasing these collaborations with Russia to stop this terrible conflict. I think that's critically important. At the same time, I think we can work with our researchers, with our collaborators, researchers, and with all nations to try and stop this continued emissions of carbon and the effect on the climate change and the effect that it does have on permafrost. I don't believe that the partnerships with Russia on permafrost are going to change the climate over the next year or whatever it takes to end this war. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. The trade-off there too is not working with Russia on permafrost. Is that going to be the lever that somehow ends this war? But thank you very much. And with 8 seconds left, Madam Chair, I yield back.
All in good faith. With that, we're going to hear from Mr. Kasten of Illinois for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to our speakers. The challenge with being late in the session is I got to try to say something novel that hasn't been said before. I also had the good fortune to travel with Congresswoman Ross to Iceland recently, and we met, among others, with former President Grimson, who's now the chairman of the Arctic Circle Organization, and fascinating conversations, a lot of it well beyond the jurisdiction of this committee. But a lot of our conversation with him was around the fact that as these sea lanes have opened up, his words, not mine, he said Russia has basically been acting like a toll collector in areas that are well beyond their international waters, but they've been allowed to block some of those areas and limit access to those areas. And I guess my first question for you, Dr. Hensman, is have you seen that, and has Russian access to these melting waters or limitations on access in anywhere interfered with our ability to do research in the region?
So we have seen tremendous increase over the last decade. We've seen tremendous increase of Russian traffic through the Bering Strait. The current conflict has certainly affected the Arctic research, particularly the collaborations that we have with the Russians. And Russia does occupy 50% of the Arctic. They have, most of or a large part of the land area, at least 50% of the land area, more than half the population, probably more than 50% of the minerals. And so it does have a big impact. The important collaborations that have ceased are the major Arctic rivers. The biggest rivers that flow into the Arctic Ocean are coming from Russia. We no longer have access to that data. They also have important measurements on the carbon emissions, as Dr. Natali mentioned. We don't have access to that data. There are other issues too, as far as in the past we have partnered on polar bear distributions, on walrus populations, on migratory waterfowl. And so there are so many important things that have ceased, important research activities that have ceased. But again, I believe at this time that is the appropriate course of action.
Okay, and you've touched on this before, but from a scientific funding perspective, one of his other observations was that the U.S. and our allies have strategic superiority in the air, strategic superiority underneath the ice cap, but increasingly, because of our lack of icebreakers, don't control the surface as much as we used to. There's a military angle to that that's outside of this jurisdiction, but can you give a little bit of color onto what the scientific community is doing to expand our access to icebreakers? Should we, where are we limited, and what would you like to see our committee do to try to make sure, and I hate to frame it in a militaristic sense, but there is that link to it. So your comments, thoughts, requests?
Yes, thank you, Representative Kasten. So I cannot address the military aspects, but I can address what the Iarpc, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, and our Arctic research community is doing to help address the scientific needs of our military. So we did talk about the infrastructure needs before, and how we are trying to develop more stable infrastructure, trying to develop better understanding of the sea properties, the ocean properties, the ocean circulation, the weather forecasting. All of those characteristics, all those scientific needs do affect our military readiness and our domain awareness for our military. And so the research that we're doing does benefit our national security.
Dr. Sfraga, with the time left, anything that you'd like to add on either of those questions?
Yes, thank you, Representative Kasten. I would say that back to my original testimony, which is if the Coast Guard does purchase commercially available icebreaker and it's retrofitted, that we ensure that the needs of our scientific and research communities placed on that on that vessel, so that we can take advantage of that research platform. And that should go for any research, any icebreaker that the United States builds. Right now, we're lined up to hopefully have 6 new polar security cutters built over the next several years, maybe decade. And the scientific community, in my opinion, their needs should be incorporated into those designs, along with other research vessels that the nation should build. That's on the research side. Obviously, presence is influence. And so there's 2 parts to your conversation with President Grimson. One is the research capacity of the United States. Here we can partner with other countries that do have far more icebreaking capacity and research vessel capacity than we do. We have good relations with these countries. We should continue to do that. And 2 is on the security side, which is, again, presence is influence in the North, whether that's with our U.S. Navy or with our United States Coast Guard.
Thank you all, and I yield back.
Okay. So before we bring this hearing to a close, I want to thank and recognize our witnesses for testifying before our committee today. We want to sincerely thank all of those dedicated to the pursuit of scientific research in the face of enormous challenges. I came into this hearing thinking ice. You know, I've read a lot of articles about a world without ice, and now I'm leaving thinking permafrost. So thank you, Dr. Natali, and for your contributions today, and thank you all for leaving this committee with a program of thought on how we can go forward for our Arctic, and particularly as those who authorize on behalf of this nation a budget, a design, and a scope of work for the future of this nation. And as a reminder to everyone watching at home that, yes, the United States is an Arctic nation, and to have, you know, this great representation here today of witnesses so connected to the beautiful state of Alaska and what contributions that state makes to our nation is certainly quite determinative. And we have just witnessed a representation change in Alaska with the passing of Mr. Young and now the arrival of Ms. Mary Patala. So, certainly encourage you to reach out to her today as well. But know that our committee as a whole stands committed to what we discussed today, and thanks you and your teams, by the way, and certainly Ms. Metcalf for everything you represent. We can't be doing this without our friends in the tribes and who are connected to some of the incredible origin stories of this nation and how we do address what is changing in the Arctic going forward without all of you. And thank you, too, to Dr. Natali for your contributions on that front as well. So the record's going to remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from members or additional questions. Some already made recognition that they were going to be submitting questions for the record, and so they may submit those for the 2-week period. And at this point, the witnesses will be excused and the hearing will now be adjourned. Thank you.